Hello everyone, and welcome to your 6th core animation tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to be covering how we can work with layer-backed views in OS X. And more specifically, we'll just talk or give a brief overview of what a layer object is. So if you're in this for iOS, a lot of this information will be important though to learn, such as what a layer is. So anyway, we'll talk about the differences between iOS and macOS X in just a bit, but let's first dive into what layers are. So this image right here is from Apple's website on core animation. This is from their guide on core animation. And before I get into that, let's talk about how drawing works in macOS X. So when macOS X came out, major change was that we now had the Cocoa framework. And Cocoa, right, uses Objective-C, and that was one of the major changes. And then we also have AppKit. And AppKit is where we have all the nice little drawing stuff, right? We have our NS table views, we have our NS buttons, we got our NS windows, and most importantly, we have NSView. And NSView is where most of the drawing happens, right? The two ways that you usually do drawing are either through NSView or through quartz calls. And if you don't really know what quartz is, that doesn't really matter. Anyway, with that being said, those were the major ways that you drew things in OS X. Now, this was fine, right? This still works fine today. We still do the same stuff, right? If you watch the Cocoa tutorials, you'll know that if you want to change or make a custom drawing in an NSView, you override drawRect, and then you can do some custom drawing. So that's fine, right? That's how we've done it forever. So, what changed? Well, in Leopard, which was 10.5, we got core animation. And why did we need this change? Well, imagine an example where you have lots of media. So you have images or videos or even OpenGL stuff, and you want to move this stuff around on the screen. So maybe you have like a video collection, and you have you're just moving them, right? You have a whole collection of videos that you want to display on the screen at the same time, and maybe you're just scrolling through this collection. And if you're scrolling through this collection of videos and there's like 20 of them on the screen at the same time, for example, how is this going to be handled by your NSView? Well, I'll tell you. The NSView would, draw all this information every time drawRect is called, which is anytime it moves or anytime it needs to redraw something. So anytime you're scrolling through and you have to move those 20 or 30 images or videos, right? It needs to redraw every single one of those. So then drawRect happens and your CPU or your Intel processor in your Mac is redrawing all this stuff all the time, right? This isn't good. This means that all your drawing calls are done on the main thread, which means that your performance, right, if the processor is working really hard to draw all this stuff, it means that the user will probably end up having really jumpy performance, and they'll be frustrated because your application would be running slow, right? It wouldn't be running at the max frames per second. Anyway, with that, the problem here obviously is that we're using the CPU, right? The CPU is doing all the work. And the benefit that we have now is that we have the GPU, which is the graphics processing unit. And the GPU is extremely good at manipulating little bits of images, which is why it's a graphics processing unit, I guess. So how does this help? So if we have a bunch of images and all this image data is stored in layers, layers are manipulated by the GPU. So if we're looking at our example right here, again, this is from Apple's documentation on core animation, we have our app window, which is represented by this stripe thing here, and then we have a layer, and the layer contains an image or the image data of this little guy, and the little guy is actually the automator icon. So this layer is stored into a layer object, and the layer object just contains the image data, so all the bits of the image. And the GPU then takes that and says, okay, we want to rotate this, 45 degrees, and we want to scale it, and we want to change the opacity to be, 25%, right? And it does all that, and then it draws it back onto the screen, again, using the GPU. So all this is really fast, right? The GPU is really fast at manipulating images. And so the drawing performance can be great, right? This means that, back to our little example, if we're scrolling through those 30 videos or images, right, then it'll have much smoother performance if it's backed into a layer. All right, so that's cool and all, but what do we want to, what does this have to do with layer backed views? Well, like I was alluding to before, the major way that we draw everything in Cocoa is using NSView for the most part. So how do we merge these two is kind of the question, right? Because layers have downfalls. They're not complete. They're not just NSViews with better performance, right? They don't have all the features that NSView have. They're not part of the responder chain, and they don't really perform mouse and swipe gestures the same way. In fact, they don't at all. So there's major drawbacks to just using CA layers. So this is where layer backed views come into, right? We kind of get the best of, well, maybe not the best, but we get part of both worlds, right? We get the NSView to handle our gestures, so like swipes and stuff like that, and it's part of the responder chain. There's other benefits as well, but also the layer can then be used in the NSView to draw its information. So what a layer backed view is essentially an NSView that has a backing store, which is the layer object, and that layer object will store that image data. So whatever's drawn from the NSView can be stored in the layer object itself, and the layer object is then the thing that gets manipulated instead of doing the drawing code for the view. So that's what happens, right? The layer can then just be the thing that draws that information, and then it can manipulate that stuff at will. All right, so that is essentially the idea of being layer backed. It just means that the drawing code can be offloaded to the layer, and the layer then can be manipulated by the GPU. If I look at a simple example here from Apple, well, it's not that simple, but an example from Apple's website as well, we can see that this sort of boxed area, which represents all these images here, and you can probably find this image online as well, but basically this represents that this view section here with all these images will be layer backed. And what does this mean? Well, it means that as soon as we layer back this image, it means that every view will have its own layer. So if we just say that this black area here wants a layer, it will be layer backed. And that means every child will also get its own layer. So that's one of the things you should know, is that if you layer back a sub view or a super view of something, then all of its subviews also get a layer. So if we say we want our view to have a layer here, that means all of its subviews, so all these little images, will also have layers. And this means that there are a bunch of images. So if they're moving around the screen, it's really going to help their performance, right? Because the image data is drawn using layers. All right, so we're going to make a very simple example here, and it's not really going to show all the complex stuff that you can do with moving stuff, but we're just going to give an introduction to how you can make a view layer backed, and we're going to be using shadows for this example. So shadow is another benefit that you can get from a CA layer. There's a bunch of different things you can get, but a shadow is something you can easily make if you're a layer backed view. So if I want this button to be layer backed, we can actually head over to this panel here. So let's just say I select this button. You kind of have this layer hierarchy of what's here. So you'll see that there's the push button, which is our button object here, and then there's the view. And anytime you're working with core animation stuff, I would suggest you basically take the super view to be layer backed. So in this example, we're going to just back this view. And by saying that the view, which this view represents the Windows view, if we say that this view is going to be layer backed, it means that the button will be layer backed as well, right? It implicitly gets a layer. Every subview of a layer backed view gets a layer. So just by checking that checkbox, it means that the push button will now have its own layer. So we don't have to check this one. Now, why did I want to check the view? Why did I not want to just check the push button? Well, the issue here is that if you go to draw something on your layer, it means that you can only really draw it on the layer itself. And if there's no other layers to draw onto, then it can't draw anything. So for our shadow example, we're going to have a shadow that casts itself onto the layer. And for this, I'll show you why this doesn't work later on in this tutorial, but essentially if you're drawing a shadow and you go outside the bounds of this button or the layer, then you have to draw onto something else. And if there's no layer to draw onto, then the shadow can't actually be drawn. So that's why you need to layer back your super views of things so that you can actually draw onto those layers. Anyway, with that being said, let's go flip over to our app Delegate and make some code. So we'll make a property here, and we'll just make it a weak property, IB outlet with our NS button, and we'll also make an IB action, and we'll just call it button pressed. Alright, so let's go back to our main menu.nib here. We'll connect our button, and we will connect our action as well to the button, and there we go. Alright, so let's go make a shadow. How do we do this? Well, we of course want to implement that method that we just made, so that was button pressed, not button pressed. And button pressed, what we want to do is essentially just make a shadow, and we're just going to make a random shadow. So to do shadows, you want to use an NS shadow object, shadow, and NS shadow alloc init. Alright, so all that's pretty standard. Then to set up the shadow, you want to just change it using different things. So we can say set shadow, for example, color. We'll start with that, most obvious one, right? So the shadow color can be some kind of NS color. So we'll say NS color with, we'll use calibrated red. And what we want to do, we're just going to use random values. And to get random values in, if you're using, what am I trying to say? If you want to get random integer values, which is what I want actually in this example, is I'm going to use arc for random. So you can say arc for random uniform, and this is a function that you can use to get random values. And the parameter that it takes is the upper bound of the random values. So this will return essentially an integer from 0 to 1 less than this upper bound. So for example, if I put a 2 in here, it means that arc for random uniform will generate either an integer that's a 0 or a 1 randomly, right? So that's what I want. And color for calibrated red takes a value from 0 to 1, right? If I want to set up some kind of color, I can set it anywhere from 0, like it could be 0.2, 0.4, etc. But it has to be some value between 0 and 1. In this case, it's just going to be 0 or 1 because I'm just using this function here and it generates integers of 0 or 1 in this case. Alright, so now I can just copy this and I'll throw it in the other ones as well. So we'll have random values for red, green, and blue. And then the alpha, we always want it just to be, we could make this random as well, but I just always want it to be 1 so that you can always see what the shadow is. Alright, so let's set some other things. We can set the shadow blur radius. And the blur radius is just some value that it blurs the radius of. So if you have a shadow, well, you'll see how this works. So let's just make another random thing. We'll make it from, I don't know, 0 to 9, I guess, for our blur radius. And the last thing that I'm going to make, set shadow offset. This uses an NS size, so we'll say NS make size. And again, we'll make random things. So arc for random uniform. The thing with NS, so what the shadow offset is, I didn't even explain that, but the shadow offset just means where the shadow is positioned. So let's say you had a shadow of 4, 4, that means that the shadow will then be offset to the right by 4 pixels essentially, or 4 points, right? So that's what a shadow offset is. If I say NS make size 4, 4, that would mean that the shadow is offset by 4, and then like 4 to the right and 4 down, essentially, or 4 up. I can't really remember, but something like that. Anyway, with that being said, let's just say that we'll want it to go from 0 to 8, so we'll say 9 there. 9 is the upper bound, right? It doesn't include 9, it's just 0 to 8. and then we will subtract 4. So this will allow us to have values from 4 to, or negative 4 to positive 4. All right, and we'll do the same thing here. So arc for random. Actually, I'll make these a little bit bigger. So let's make this like 21 minus 10 and 21 minus 10, right? That should give us values from negative 10 to positive 10. All right, so the last step, of course, is to apply this shadow. So to do that, we can say self.button and set shadow, and we can say shadow, right? Now this will just apply it directly, so we can see this in action if we run this. So we'll run it, and as you can see, and oops, I screwed something up. So what did I screw up? I probably screwed up. Yeah, I know what I screwed up. So there's a major issue if you aren't careful with this, is that arc for random returns a UI int 32, which is a unsigned integer. So if you don't actually cast this right, you would either get an undefined value or you will get the right thing. So anyway, you have to cast this as an int because an unsigned int only means you can have positive values. So anytime you have a negative value, it's going to break it. So you have to cast the return of your arc for random uniform to be an int so that you can have negative values. All right, let's try that again so that you don't think I'm crazy. As you can see, we have little shadows here popping up, and they're different colors, right? Random colors, and you can see those there, and they're randomly popping up in different places. You can see the blur radius, right? You can see that the blur radius there is pretty high because it's blurring that amount, and that's essentially what it means to have a shadow, right? And this is all brought to you by being layer backed. Now if I go back to this example and I go over to my layers over here, and I have to select a view. And again, this, sorry, I didn't even mention where this was, but this is in the View Effects Inspector. And this is where basically it's this little, you can see a bunch of layers. So it's where you would influence the layers on your views and stuff. So that's in the inspector over here. And as you can see though, let's just change it so that this is only enabled on the push button, for example. So if I do that, and I do it on the push button, you can see that it will kind of cut off different things. So right there, you can kind of actually see the shadow is being cut off. And that's just because there's no, the super view didn't contain a layer, and so the layer can't actually draw it onto that layer, and so the shadow gets cut off. So that's why we have to enable the super view to have a layer so that it can actually draw the shadow onto that layer as well. Right? If it doesn't have a layer to draw onto, it can't draw onto it. All right, so that fixes our problem. Another thing that we might want to note is if we disable it and we try the same thing, you can see that you won't get anything. So this is really only a feature that you get if you're layer backed. If you're not layer backed at all, you will not get shadows. All right, so another thing we can try here is enabling that again. And let's start animating this maybe. So let's animate the shadow change. We can use that animator proxy that we were using before, and this will actually animate the change of the shadow. So if I click it, you can see that the shadow kind of does this nice little animation to move, and it's going to be hard to see on my screen since this is so small, but you'll see it on yours for sure. And you can see that the shadow sort of slowly animates across to the different positions. All right, so that's that. What's another thing that we can do? Well, we can use, we can rotate the button if we want. This is probably not something you'd ever want to do in real life, but we can do it anyway. So let's rotate our button. We'll just rotate it at the top here. So we'll say self.button, and we'll use the, no, we don't want to use the animator for that. We want to set the frame center rotation, and that will rotate the button around its center. And then we want to basically rotate it, I don't know, let's rotate it like 10 degrees every time. So we'll say self.button.frame center rotation. That gets the current rotation of the button. And then we'll just add 10 to it, like that. All right, so there we go. Let's test it out and see how it works. So we can rotate this around, and you can see that the shadow actually follows the button itself. So as the button's rotating around, we can see that the shadow follows the button rather nicely. All right, so that is how you can work with layer-backed views in OS X. And the main thing that you'll just want to remember when you're trying this out is to always back the super view of the thing you're animating. So if you're backing the button, you'll always want to back the super view of the button. Don't just back the button, because if you try to draw stuff that's outside of your view, it doesn't always work, and if you'll just get bad behavior half the time. So just make sure that the super view is the thing that has a layer, and then your button implicitly gets its own layer as well. The last thing that I have to show you is how to do this manually, so not using Interface Builder. So if I get rid of this here, I'll disable that. And so now we don't have a layer-backed view. And I want to do this in code. So I could do this using application did finish launching. I'll just say self.button, and we say set wants layer. And I just set it to yes. This is how you tell the button to enable a layer. Now, like I was saying before, though, we want the super layer to be the one that actually gets the layer, right? We don't want the button to be the one that gets the layer. We want the super layer to also have one. So we can just say super view, and that will tell the super view that it should get a layer. So that's now it takes the button, it finds the super view, which is the view in the window, and it tells it to get a layer. When we tell the super view to get a layer, then all of its children get layers as well, so the button will implicitly get its own layer. And so this is all we have to say for the button to have one. All right, so if we run this, we can see that there's the button, and it works the same as before. Pretty. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave your questions in the comments below. The last very important thing that I should address about this is that you should never, if you're a layer-backed view, you should never address the layer directly. Now you can by saying, for example, self.button.layer. This gets you the layer that's actually being, backing your button. But you should never change any of the properties on it. So, you could say something like this, and you probably shouldn't do that. That would probably, I'm not sure if quarter radius is bad, but you should never change, a general rule of thumb is that you should never change the frame or the layer directly. So if you wanted to say, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something else, but basically if you're layer backed, just don't change the layer directly, because it's probably bad. You should always use the methods that are given to you by the button itself. So, set shadow, you could set the shadow directly on the layer. However, we do it using the NSButton method set shadow. So that's the idea. Don't try to directly change the things. You should only, or don't directly change the layer. Just try to change it with the methods that are provided using NSButton or whatever. All right, so anyway, that's all I have to say for this tutorial. Again, if you have any questions on this tutorial, feel free to leave your questions in the comment section below. Please subscribe to the channel and to me on Twitter for all the updates there. And I will see you in an upcoming core animation tutorial. See you then.